Good day and welcome to this exciting session on digital rights. My name is Mark Wiseman and I'll be your host for the next hour. And before we start, this is an interactive session, so please keep the conversation going in the chat. If you have a specific question for one of the guests, please use the Ask the Guest button on the side of your screen. We will be answering questions at the end of this session. Now, throughout the session, we also have some questions for you. You see some opinion polls popping up. Please fill those in so we can hear your thoughts and discuss those as well. Now, during this session, we will be having discussions with three interesting speakers. Rima Hamadan, she is joining us from Libya. Trésor Kalonji, he is joining from Congo, and Vitika Yadav, she is joining from India. And these discussions will be led by Melody Patry. She is the advocacy director at Access Now. I look very much to hear these discussions. I hope you do too. Let's begin. Melody, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. And it's true, when you think about getting your news today, you think about social media, you think about online newspapers, maybe you even have your newspapers apps on your phone. But the reality is also that these platforms can sometimes be heavily manipulated, controlled, and sometimes they disappear completely. That's the case during internet shutdowns, and these have happened over 200 times and have affected 33 countries last year. This impacted millions of people, and of course, young voices were heavily impacted. And that's why RNW Media, which is an international organization working to promote young voices through the use of digital media, has organized this session today and has invited me to be part. So we'll be having this discussion with the three guests that Mark presented. And we're going to start straight away with a question to Vitika. But we're going to talk about all of those online content producers that don't necessarily fit within the traditional category of journalists. These are the communities that don't necessarily have professional trainings, and their rights are not always protected the same way than other journalists. So we're going to shed light on what it's like to be a journalist in their context and what challenges they face from censorships to internet shutdowns. So as I said, our first guest will be Vitika. Vitika is the head of Love Matters India. It's a project that was born at RNW Media and that has moved to become independent. Love Matters is a platform bringing uncensored information to young people in India on sexual health and rights. Vitika is also a member of the Global Advisory Board for Sexual Health and Well-being. And Vitika, thank you. It's so good to have you today. Noting the role of the internet in development of Love Matters, why do you think it's so important to talk about digital rights?
Thank you, Melody. Well, one, the internet perhaps has been the biggest invention of our times. We all know that it is a huge amplifier of information. It has enabled information to travel faster across countries using different platforms. And if you just look at ourselves, the amount of stuff that we have learned via the internet, even campaigning, in the kind of work that we do, it is tremendous. And in a world where content is really being produced every single second, we interact on online platforms. I mean, during Corona times, all our interactions, our work, our school, everything is happening on the online platforms. We find our information online, we form opinions online, we are shopping online. So the digital rights, when we talk about digital rights, they are indeed human rights. This is a very, very important aspect of our lives today. So it is indeed important to talk about the challenges when we talk about digital spaces, when we talk about digital rights. And we have to talk about content, the quality of content, barriers of content, and media consumption. It is also, it is also not just from the perspective of producing good media, but it is also about what kind of media do we consume? What is the consumption pattern? Are we as consumers being manipulated by online platforms to form opinions, to sort of buy certain things, or to even even vote for a political party. So even for winning elections, we know that online platforms have tremendous power today. And it is very important to talk about the investments that go behind running these online media platforms. And for us as consumers to ask ourselves that, do they really reflect any personal political agendas or not?
Absolutely. And actually, this whole conference was supposed to be in person, but is happening online. So when we talk about moving the intersection between online and offline, this very session is the example of it. And talking about consumption, we'll have the opportunity to talk about what you touched on when it comes to how we are consumers of content online, and what does this also affect not just our everyday life but also our democracy. But first, let me ask a question to our second guest, Trésor. Trésor is the online content editor and moderator at Habari RDC, the project of RNW Media working on civic cohesion and inclusive governance in Congo. Trésor, you heard Vitika talking about access of online spaces and the role it plays in our everyday media consumption. As an online editor, how free do you actually feel to publish your desired content online in the context of DRC?
Thank you very much. I can say that here in Congo, there has been recently elections, and things have opened up a bit. Before, we couldn't publish some topics like the wealth of the family of the president, for example, or all the connections with questionable offshore companies like those described in the case of Panama Papers, the Panama Papers case. So the members of the presidential family were the red line never to cross if we didn't want to face the fury of secret services. Many journalists, many activists have been arrested here just because they dared to question those people who are around the president and around men of big power. So that's an example among many others cases, like there is the case of the death of United Nations investigators here who have been killed in mysterious conditions, an American and a Swedish woman. So but for now, they control less content now. There is a new president in office, but although the challenges that we are facing didn't disappear, they've only taken a different shape.
Thank you. And I think that one of these challenges is the existence of internet shutdowns and the fact that internet shutdowns happen in DRC. So, Mark, I believe that we've got a video to share with the public about that.
Yes, with regards to access to the internet and why it's important to advocate for digital rights, perhaps it's a good idea to have a look at this video first from the DRC. This was made by Lemien. He's a blogger at Habari RDC, and he's going to talk about internet shutdowns and their impact on people.
It started with an endless stream of messages, friends and colleagues saying they were having problems with their internet connection. The messages became fewer and fewer, until my internet connection was also gone. And this was not the first time. This time, the government imposed a shutdown for 3 long weeks, right after the highly contested presidential elections. Of course, I use the internet to stay in touch with my social cycle. But as a journalist, the internet is essential for my work, doing online research, publishing articles, engaging with our sources and readers. People were trying to get the internet by crossing the border to Congo-Brazzaville and Rwanda. Over there, local dealers were offering data packages with tripled prices overnight. I bought a SIM card at the border too, but it was dangerous. I could be arrested for this. an internet shutdown has a huge effect on society. The entire impact is not even measurable. The internet is more than just a communication tool. We cannot separate ourselves from it. It allows us to transfer money, to study, to work, and to advocate for our rights. It shapes our everyday lives. And you? How would you feel when you can be online for 3 weeks in a row? How would you speak?
Right, back to you, Melody.
Yeah, and I'm struck by, this question. What would you do if you couldn't be online for 3 weeks? I mean, already when my phone runs out of battery and I don't have the internet for 2 seconds, I'm immediately in panic. So watching this video, Trésor, brings a question to mind. Who orders those internet shutdowns? Is it the government? Is it the secret services? Is there a special unit? Who is responsible for these internet shutdowns in Congo?
It's a very difficult question. There are different units within the government, different ministries, each controlling the online spaces and setting their own rules. There is, for example, the Ministry of Information and Technology, which is one of them, which is supposed to be the one ruling internet. But there is also the Interior Affairs Ministry, because they say that it is related to national security, so they have to intervene in these cases. There are multiple sources of power and lack of clarity on who is responsible for defining the rules make it also for us very difficult to advocate for digital life, and because we don't know where to place our energy and fights. So in the past, internet shutdowns, especially during crucial times during elections or during a street protest of opposition forces, it was a real challenge for us because it was unknown who between Ministry of Interior, between Information Technology Ministry, or even Secret Services, you highlighted it, who can shut down the internet and who can, from that, start to track down people who are posting messages online. These days, with the new government in place, like I said, our challenges become about the way the government deals with online platforms. The contents, the way of production, the legal framework doesn't for the moment. For information, for example, online media is under the supervision now of the, as I said, of the Ministry of Information, but that ministry. That ministry is now trying to control the contents online. There is between the former system, it makes us complicated and it's time consuming for us to know who is the legal entity to which we have to address to.
All right. Well, as a human rights advocate myself, I only know how difficult it is when you have to navigate between different targets for your advocacy. And so I hear how this is a challenge, even more so as a journalist when you don't even know who to bring a claim up to. So it's a good time to turn to Rima, our third guest from Libya. Rima Hamidan is the project director at Huna Libya. Huna Libya is an online platform where young people from different backgrounds can safely meet and engage in dialogue and discussion. So, Rima, we're approaching the 10-year anniversary of the so-called Arab Spring, and the context in Libya is maybe very difficult for people to grasp on. So, can you maybe give us a bit more information about the current context in your country and what's going on when it comes to freedom of expression online?
Thank you, Melody. Well, the Libyan context faces many challenges when it comes to freedom of expression. and it's reflected on the online world. Libya is going through a transitional period since 2011 after the fall of a dictatorship that lasted 42 years. And it's going through an armed civil conflict that imposed an unstable security situation, which affected the public freedoms and, most importantly, the freedom of expression. The digital society in Libya is experiencing challenges related to the spread of political polarization between the fighting parties, and also hate speech and fake news. All of this, and especially hate speech, contributed several times to restriction to young journalists and activists to share their voices online. Hona Libya is trying, through its digital platforms, to open safe spaces for young people to express their voices within this chaotic situation. Our digital community consists of more than 360,000 followers on Facebook, for example, and our online campaigns reach this year nearly 1 million impressions each time. I'm talking to you about a country that's a population of 6 million people, and 60% of them are young people. So the need of is at the heart of today's digital community needs in Libya, and that's what we are trying to do at Hona Libya.
Thank you so much, Rima, for this background. And I think it helps us understand even more so, especially in the current circumstances, the importance of not just safe access to the internet, but also who has access to the internet and how. And I believe that people have had the opportunity to answer the question from the poll, and the results are in. Mark, can you confirm?
That's right, Melody. We have results from the first poll. And again, I want to appreciate the audience also for interacting with us. I do want to encourage you also to use the chat and to use the Ask the Guest button to ask questions to our speakers here. We want to include you in our conversation, so please do keep the conversation going between us. The results of the poll, the first question was, which one poses a bigger threat to freedom of speech? A was government-imposed limitations, B, bad infrastructure, and C, self-censorship. And A, government-imposed limitation was voted 85%. Bad infrastructure was voted 15%, and 0% voted self-censorship, number C. So those are the results.
Thank you very much. And I mean, not really surprising to see that 85% people believe that government being responsible for, the impact of internet freedom online is so prevalent. I wonder if our guest would think differently about the self-censorship piece. But let's turn to Vitika. I'd like to go back to your initial remarks, because we're talking about the role of governments, but you specifically mentioned the role of tech giants and how we can hold all decision makers accountable, not just governments, but also these big tech companies, and sometimes not so big tech companies that are responsible for the content that we see and the spaces that we have access to online. Trésor mentioned advocacy and the difficulty to navigate campaigning with so many different targets. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on and your experience in this regard.
Sure. So I guess when we're talking about power and authority when it comes to digital platforms, we're talking about tech giants, we're talking about political parties. And I think the first problem is that we have to understand there is significant investment that is backing these media platforms, and to understand that perhaps they are also politically motivated. Given the kind of money that is, that is invested in it and the kind of returns that people are expecting. Now, who decides which information should be censored and why? Who decides on internet surveillance? Is it the ruling party? Yes, perhaps. Of course, those who own the platforms have a big say in it as well. And there is a power play, which we have to understand and which we have to recognize. And we have to understand that there is a threat to press freedom. How do we link this to media consumption patterns? Again, the point that I made earlier. What kind of media has a bigger audience today? What does the trend look like? If one just has to give a look at the kind of media consumption and news consumption in India, one would possibly get the answer. It is not the smartest content that we are consuming, and what is making that content trend? Are these platforms being manipulated? We have the answers. Yes, they are being manipulated. We are being manipulated as consumers. And the challenges are even bigger also because I think when we talk about accountability, with tech giants or with the government, it's a very tokenistic approach. One would see that almost all these online big platforms have something which they call the public policy department now, and they seem to be there to really encourage dialogue between non-profits and to really see how to make it work in the best interest of people and to talk about censorship. But quite honestly, they're still struggling to figure out how to manage certain things around non-profit activities. And I say this from I'll use an example from my own area of work. Sexual health information is much more censored than any other information on the digital platforms. And it is indeed information about women, their bodies, their health, which is much, much more censored than when you compare it with information about men's health. And that's not it. This is something that is our struggle every single day in our work. The kind of content that is taken down. Now, who's taking those decisions? We are speaking to the public policy departments for years now, but has anything changed? Well, not really. And then you're wondering, why is it taking them so long to really understand that this censorship is wrong? And there is a big problem. And looking at the scenario, what we also did was, of course, we are in this advocacy space also when we talk about online censorship. So what we did was to do a study on content takedowns by Facebook across Love Matters platforms across different countries. And what we saw was that how discriminatory the algorithms were and how gendered they were. Now, content moderation, as they call it, has become a much debated issue because they decide what is going to be censored and what is going to stay. And that is a threat to freedom of expression, and it is also a threat to access to good quality information. It has impact not only on the kind of content that is visible on the online platforms, which is good, high quality content that should be visible and that should be accessible for people, but also for consumers, because are consumers getting the choice to choose between what is good content and perhaps all kinds of content that is out there. Again, this also reflects on the kind of advertisements that are allowed with regard to information giving organizations and how that is constantly violated by the censorship policies, be it Facebook or be it Google. I think an interesting thing is also that some of these platforms have introduced what they call some kind of funds, which are essential, which help nonprofits. It's basically a grant that would help nonprofits put some ads money on the content and stuff. And if you actually see how that is outlined, it really is again very, very tokenistic. You actually cannot run ads on quality content and content that people need to have a look at, the content that actually answers the kind of questions and concerns that people have. And it has an impact on how we are consuming content, how people are being manipulated in terms of what they're being offered. And also, according to Ranking Digital Rights 2020, Facebook provided some information about the content moderation of their advertisements, but it is still impossible to evaluate their process for rejecting specific ads. It is just extremely random. Anything from a girl proposing, a boy, to anything around even white discharge can be censored because it does not follow Facebook's policy, and who decides this policy and who decides its censorship. So apparently what we are definitely seeing is that everything that happens is controlled by these digital platforms in terms of content takedowns and moderation has a disproportionate effect on silencing the voices of marginalized groups, marginalized people, and that includes women.
Thank you, Vidika, and thank you for really bringing to light, using your experience, how platforms do matter and how their policies directly impact the information that we have access to, not just how we consume through the algorithm that you mentioned, but also through specific policies that sometimes don't necessarily match a country's policy or even international norms when it comes to, I don't know if we take, you mentioned sexual health, but if we that's related also to, nudity and being able to see women's breast online and such. So these kind of studies are so helpful to help us understand the implication of those policies in content consumption, but also in the cohesion that fabrics society increasingly more on those platforms. There was actually another study conducted by RNW Media Project in Yemen. I think we're going to see the slides right now. Yes. So in this study, as you can see, a majority indicated that there is almost no space for freedom of expression of news reporting, 54%. 74% of the respondents selected political, geographical, or religious polarization as the main reason that negatively impacts the role of media in Yemen. So it seems like it's a two-way street, because media is impacted by polarization, but sometimes media also reinforce polarization. So Rima, we know that those algorithms that Vitika talks about are heavily gender influenced and divided. What's your take on that? How can we make sure that we bridge finally, if not offline, but at least that we bridge or not reinforce the gender gap in online spaces? Rima? Oh, Rima's gone. Another impact, Rima is being censored involuntarily by tech. So when we talk about tech, these are part of the consequences. And when we talk about access and internet infrastructure, this all comes to play during this session. So let's just move. I don't know if we already have the results for the second poll, Mark?
Not yet, no.
Not yet, so that's fine. In that case, I'm just going to turn to Trésor while we wait for Rima to be back. Trésor, I know that you guys at Habari RDC have recently launched an effort to fight disinformation in DRC. Disinformation and fake news, that's been another very popular, trendy topic in the past few years. And you, I believe, have a project to encourage what you call information hygiene on Twitter and on other platforms. Can you tell us a bit more about this? But can maybe Trésor answer? All right, so as we lost Trésor, I will ask him my question again after. But Rima, if you're back, I just asked you previously a question about, the role of algorithms in reinforcing, sometimes amplifying the gender gap that we're experiencing in the offline world online. So what do you think we can do to make sure that we're closing or we're bridging this gap in online spaces?
And sorry for the connection. Indeed, bridging the gender gap is important in these cases for more gender inclusion. In Libya, there is 5.10 million social media users with a percentage of 75%, mostly as Facebook users. The female participation in the online spaces is estimated by Facebook to be 38%, which is low comparing to the total connections. However, Libya's engagement rates between genders are 45% for females and 55% for males, which is a more balanced percentages. So how we reach this percentage? The key is the 5 pillars of inclusive approach of RNW Media, which are inclusive communities, inclusive partnerships, inclusive teams, technologies, and content. This includes a moderation strategy that creates a safe discussion to reduce harassment and hate speech that women or content creator can witness, or anyone within our platforms. Also, the approach includes the content that focuses on women's rights issues within the Libyan context, with the stories and testimonies from real life wars, which encourage people to believe more in the ideas of that brings more women rights issue into the light. Also, our content focuses on a wide connection, we have a wide connection of women content creators who support our topics of GBV, women rights.
All right, so Rima is experiencing some power outage, which again reflects the challenges that are the topics at the center of this session, the challenges that online media producers are facing on a daily basis in various parts of the world. So while we're waiting for Rima to be back, I think that we can have a look at the results of the second poll.
That's right, Melody.
Mark?
Yes, we do have the results from the second poll. The second poll was governments should censor media content they consider harmful. A, fully agree, 0% of the votes. B, somewhat agree, 60% of the votes. C, somewhat disagree, 10% of the votes. And D, fully disagree, 30% of the votes. So a bit more division than the last one.
Mark, I'm sorry, could you repeat the first figures? I did not hear properly.
Of course. Fully agree, 0%. Somewhat agree, 60%. Somewhat disagree, 10%. And fully disagree, 30%.
Thank you. I was just taking notes. Perfect. So it looks like there is some agreement about the disagreement, which is that governments should not necessarily censor the media that they consider harmful. It's interesting because in Vitica, you spoke about, not the role of governments in removing content on social media, but mostly about social media and how their policies are basically creating new norms. What do you think is a solution in that case? If companies have now more power than governments, I know that they don't always want that power. They don't necessarily want to be the arbiter or what should or shouldn't be online. How do you think can we place back the citizen at the center? How can we make sure that the people are the ones who can have, a say in internet governance and who is or isn't suited to govern what we can see or not online?
Yeah, so I feel this has to be a consultative process, and the only way it can become consultative and participatory is when people actually know how to use digital platforms. Now, being on digital platforms and being able to use it does not mean that you are fully informed about how these digital platforms work. So I think the first, when we want shared ownership of deciding how to hold the digital platforms accountable, how to make sure that there is a participatory structure in terms of how we decide on censorship and what is good content and what is bad content. It also means that we have to empower people to really understand how to really use digital platforms, which is different from just downloading an app or whatever and just signing up for using a platform. And I guess the problem is that worldwide, when we talk about digital penetration, it has increased every single day, but unfortunately there hasn't been much focus on digital literacy. And that's really where the big gap is, and this is where the power is coming in play, right? I mean, the online platforms and tech giants and those who are backing these, investing in these platforms, know that there is a huge gap. And this is the gap which is taking the power away from people, and which is the space where we really, really need to advocate. We have to say that while people are thrown into these, into digital platforms, they also need to be told how do just not how these platforms operate, but what does it really mean, in terms of privacy and ethics and accountability and security and safety. And people have to be empowered to ask these questions, to make sure that they understand what it means when they become a user of a particular platform, and to be able to say, well, I use this platform, and what it means in context of free speech, what it means in context of press freedom, how they can consume responsibly, how to be a responsible consumer of digital platforms. So I think, the first thing is to be educated about using digital platforms, which is not, again, like I said, not just knowing how to be on that platform, but really knowing how it works and knowing your rights in context of that platform. And then I guess it's also about, when we talk about holding more power, it is also about having understanding of what separates good from bad media. Now, who decides what is good media and who decides what is bad media? But all of us do know and do understand that there is significant knowledge and information out there, which is about what press freedom means, what is good media, what is potentially harmful media, and how to understand that, when you're being manipulated, what is your right as a consumer? How can you advocate in these spaces? How can you actually come together and use these platforms for campaigning, even for the tech giants and for possibly the investors and political parties that are using these platforms. So I think there is much more investment in education that is needed, more conversations like the one that we are having today. So important to understand these gaps and these challenges, how we're being manipulated, and what will it take to really make people understand, know how to use, how they actually are giving business to these tech giants and platforms, and they have a responsibility also towards towards these platforms, to tell them, well, this works, this does not work, and and around censorship, of course. I think the big problem here is, again, how do we come to a definition of what defines, again, good and bad, because we all have our own perspective on what can be censored and what should be censored, and it is largely guided by our own personal opinions or our political motives, and lots of things. But there has to be universal understanding on what is good and what is bad, what is acceptable, what is unacceptable, and that is where the users can come back in power. And be at the center and core of saying that, well, we decide to use this platform, and we say no to using this platform if it does not give us what we need.
Yes, Vitika. And actually, when you talk about, collectively deciding what is or isn't acceptable online, I know that one of the challenges that we all face, but that tech platforms especially face as hosting and pushing out that content, is how do you do that form of content moderation at scale, and how do you, promote good practice and good policies? Certainly, their terms and conditions could be improved to make them more intelligible for people. But I agree that a lot more needs to be done to empower and give agency to the users who are on those platforms. And so this is related to the question that I had to you, Trésor, a bit before, about disinformation and, all of these disinformation campaigns that we see online, and what is the role of Habari RDC in promoting information hygiene? Do you share tips? How does it work exactly, that campaign to fight disinformation online and impact on the hygiene of the online content?
Thank you. Sorry first for the interruption. When we are talking about politics and censorship, we can understand that sometimes someone somewhere is upset. So about disinformation, during COVID-19 outbreak here in DRC, we realized that there is a lot of new fake news, or technically disinformation, malinformation, and misinformation spread online. And it was especially on Twitter. And it was about the coronavirus itself. There were people talking about mysterious treatments. There are people talking about conspiracy theories. So we started a campaign that we called Habari Decrypt, like the decrypting, in which we were presenting our audience with fact-checked articles, so as to give them an alternative narrative to what they were reading and watching online, because there are many people who picture themselves as specialists in bacteriology, in chemistry, and so on. But above all, we engaged in discussions with our followers to try to make them understand the severity of the illness. It's very easy to say, okay, coronavirus exists, but it's also difficult to explain to people how many are dying in the US, in Europe, in Asia, but there is no case here in Congo. People were mostly saying, okay, but if corona exists, why my neighbor, why there is no one I know who is infected by that disease? So we started on Twitter, because it's an open platform, and our social listening tools were able to get enough data on how rumors about COVID were spreading from there, and from there reaching other platforms like WhatsApp and Facebook. So DRC, just before the COVID outbreak, was experiencing already an Ebola outbreak. Ebola is another contagious and deadly disease. And so when COVID arose, there was defiance from people on how the government was dealing with both crises, because with Ebola, there was a defiance of the people. They were saying that, okay, Ebola is there just because you want it to be there, you want it to continue because it gives you money, it gives you resources, it gives you international funds from the international community. Now you are coming with another disease, which is not so serious, but you want it to be serious just because to channel the same amount of money, and so as that you can use that money for your personal business and so on. So it was the general atmosphere that was reigning online about the way to deal with both Ebola and both COVID-19. And in such atmosphere, the same defiance was transposed, as I say, from Ebola to COVID. And it was difficult to have people support countering coronavirus because they thought that it was the same scenario. People were not dying really. There were not really things to be alarmed of. And that's in that context that in Abari we decided to launch that campaign, Abari Decrypt.
Thank you, Trésor. And that's, I think, a case in point in, that goes even beyond media literacy. It's about what Vitika mentioned earlier in terms of understanding the space that we are in, the platforms that host us, and trying to see how the information that we share can be manipulated, distorted, pushed. All of these initiatives, I think, have a direct impact on us as consumer of news, but us also as producers of news, because somehow maybe when we share a link to an article, when we share a piece of information, if we do not have that education to verify it, and we can easily end up in an environment that is full of information that is very difficult to understand. And so in all of that content that is being shared online, it's sometimes very difficult to hear and identify the voices that we would want to promote, that we would want to push out. Back to you, Rima, and welcome back. I have a question before we round off and listen to the questions from the audience. We talked about all of these voices, how sometimes they are buried or lost in the amount of content, sometimes disinformation content online. But when we do have access to those voices, and I think your voice is one of those, who needs to hear those voices?
That's an important question, Melody. As within the Libyan context, decision makers in the Libyan government in this stage of transitional period have already seen the importance of addressing safe online spaces, as I believe, for peace building. But we still lack the will to bring this up to policy frameworks for peace building. So the support of international community who plays an important role for peace building in Libya with the Libyan situation which can be concluded with the UN efforts. It's important to support the freedom of expression in Libya and to bring more attention to the importance of law implementation and law improvements, and addressing the freedom of expression in online spaces and public policies, to focus more on the safe spaces for both men and women in the online civic spaces. Also, it's important for the Libyan society as well to be aware of the importance of digital rights now in Libya, especially in this period, which will need more awareness raising to help people safe spaces in both online and offline. So it's in this a very important period of the Libyan history where changes are being made and human rights are needed more than ever. So what's needed now is to focus more on seeing this the importance of freedom of expression in law implementation and laws and regulations that supports freedom of expression online, not just the importance of it as a priority for the next period of the Libyan transitional phase.
Thank you, Rima. What I hear from you is actually, despite the different context, very similar to what Vitika mentioned in India and also Trésor in DRC when it comes to, education, making sure that people are aware about their rights, that they are aware about the different conditions of the platforms that they sign on to. Of course, I don't think that we can guarantee that people are going to read the very long terms and conditions of each platform so that they will understand the full media ecosystem where they operate, but it's definitely one of our responsibilities to encourage them and to push for better policies. The policy framework is crucial, and just to recap this conversation, because we touched on several topics, we need to make sure that governments refrain from cutting access to the internet, that they refrain from voluntarily censoring and disrupting freedom of expression on the voices. At the same time, we need to make sure that we hold tech giants and tech companies accountable for the content that they host, and not just for the content that they host, but they have to be accountable for their policies and how their policies are sometimes amplifying discrimination or sometimes amplifying gender gaps and the marginalization of communities that are already targeted in the offline world. And then we, of course, talked about the responsibility of us all, like the collective responsibility to share knowledge, to share information about those existing policies, but especially about our rights and about the importance to use our right to freedom of expression, but also to face and not to undermine the threats and the challenges posed by hate speech, posed by disinformation and other tactics and campaigns to disrupt the news consumption on the online world. So back to you, Mark. I'm sure people had lots of questions to our wonderful speakers.
Yes, this is not only a very diverse session in terms of speakers and our moderator, but we also have at this point viewers from all over the world, and they have questions. The first question is for Vitika. This is from June Lee. She is from Seoul, Korea, and she asks, how many regulations should be held on social media platforms in terms of hate speech and misinformation?
How many regulations should be? Sorry, could you repeat?
How many regulations should be held on social media platforms in terms of hate speech and misinformation?
Many. Again, who defines, what is, I think we need to have universally accepted definitions of hate speech. And I think that has to be regulated. There has to be a place for it. And definitely, I don't think it is about how many times it has to be regulated. I think it is just about having a very clear policy that defines, and there is a universal understanding and acceptance of what should be the moderation policy for hate speech. What does it really mean? Should it be different for every country and every context? Perhaps no. What is the universally accepted definition of, moderating hate speech? What does hate speech really mean, and what are the standards and that need to be there when people are working on regulation policies? And all different platforms must follow them. And again, this is not something that has to be a top down approach of political parties deciding, or country specific information that is coming down to platforms, but there has to be, just like we talk about sustainable development goals, I think we have to really talk about moderation in that context. What does it really mean, when we talk about rights issues?
Thank you, Vitika. I know that June is still active in the chat. So June, thank you for interacting with us, and I hope this was a useful answer for you. We're going on to the second question, is for Trésor Kalonji. How does internet suspension affect formal and informal education of all, and especially online journalists?
The problem, thank you for the question. The problem here in Congo is that we don't have a way, as it was said in the video of Lemia, we don't have I can say the tools to measure really how really impacted education. But for online media, like Barry, we are not alone. There are many online media who are very influent here in Congo. It's really impacted the way they work. During the shutdown, it was now that traditional media, those broadcasting in traditional ways, were the only active, and people had not an alternative way of being informed. And it's like we were back in the 90s, where there was a state-controlled TV and radio, and there were no way for other people to be informed of what was happening in the country. So shutting down the internet, it's like shutting down, I cannot say democracy, but shutting down free speech. And when you see those who are allowed to broadcast in free, when I say in free, it's through satellite, it's through TNT and so on, there is no diversity. There's no diversity most of the time. Though people rely, there is a study of Hootsuite, I think, and We Are Social, saying that most of the people, young people, they get information online. They go online, mainly on social media, to get news about what is happening, and they have that ability to interact with other people on the situation in our country. So when you cut the internet, you deny them that ability to express, and you deny them also that ability to be informed.
Right. Thank you, Trésor. Just in light of this question, we've got another question, which is for everyone. This is: how often do governments in your country shut down the internet? Let me start with Rima to make it easy.
Thank you. I think our problem is not that the government is shutting down the internet for a specific reason. Our problem is with the power shortage and power cuts that affects the internet services within the country due to the unstable situation and unstable security situation in the country. So sometimes we have days or long hours of the day without any power to access internet, which affects somehow our access to information and our freedom of expression. So that's one of the main issues that we are facing in Libya since 2011. That affects our accessibility to the internet services, which hadn't got the chance to be improved by the government, as it wasn't one of the priorities, as the ongoing conflicts affect the priorities of the government to have a security situation that is balanced year after year. So our main issue that the shutdowns of the internet are based on the power cut situation in Libya for years so far.
Thank you, Rima. Vitika, how is that for you in India?
Thank you for the question. Again, I think in India, what political parties perhaps have realized is the power that the digital platforms hold, and how they can be great amplifiers of spreading misinformation, spreading fake news, and spreading hate. So I think the intention is not really to shut down, but to manipulate and use these digital platforms for their own political agendas and to spread hate. And that's how I guess it is a little different. And that's where the problem, when we talk about media consumption pattern, and we talk about what is trending, what makes news, what are people consuming, and digital literacy. Are people empowered enough to even understand how to differentiate between good and bad media? They're able to differentiate between information and fake news that is being amplified using these platforms. So I think the idea in India is really different, not to shut down, but to really play on the power of increasing digital penetration, and to be able to use it for their own political and personal agendas.
Thank you, Vitika. I have another question for Trésor. Could you elaborate on your advocacy activities in DRC, given the challenges you mentioned and the target organizations are not so clear? Let me repeat that for you. Sorry. Could you elaborate on your advocacy activities in DRC, given the challenges you mentioned and the target organizations not being so clear?
So, if I understand, he wants us to, I didn't catch it very well.
Yeah. If you could elaborate on your advocacy activities in the DRC, especially given the challenges that you mentioned earlier, yeah. And also which organizations do you target in this regard?
Okay. So for now, Abari is trying to get in touch with civil society, which are specialized in internet activities. They're like the Internet Society community. There are also other interest groups who are working on those issues, mainly online media. Online media here have a platform where they gather so as to talk about those issues. So we are partnering with those organizations for the upcoming year to see how we can together advocate in a better way and target all the authorities at all levels so as to make them understand that internet is a land of opportunity, a land where people can express themselves and not a battleground. So for the next year, we are going to get as many partnerships as possible with local organizations and even on the international level to make it go forwards.
Great. Thank you, Trésor. Thank you, Vitika. Thank you, Rima, for answering these questions. I hope for those viewing that your answers were sufficient enough to your questions and that you've got some clarity out of our speakers. I also have one more question for Melody. The question is, what's next? We talk about digital rights and the role of the governments, but what is the ask and what are the next steps?
Not an easy one for a last question, Mark. And just before I answer, I want to get back to one of the first questions that we got about internet shutdowns, to say that indeed shutdowns are different in different countries. And interestingly, actually, you would be surprised, but India is the #1 country in terms of the number of internet shutdowns that are ordered in the world. But the way that they do it is completely different to how they do it in DRC, because they're more targeted shutdowns. They target specific regions or towns. So as Vitika mentioned, the politics are completely different in the implementation and the control of online spaces. So I just wanted to bring that clarification and to tell all of our listeners that the geographies of shutdowns varies in the way that they're being ordered as well, and how they impact people. As for next steps, as I said, not an easy question. I think that we have established a few steps during this conversation when it comes to media literacy, when it comes to the tools that are available to people to make them to give them some power, when it comes to understanding the platforms, understanding the terms of the platforms, but also influencing platforms in, for example, how they moderate content? How do we want to establish those guides? How do we want to ensure that we have principles and values that are common across the world? And I understand that doing it within this scope and at that scale is sometimes challenging, but it's a challenge that I think everyone attending that conference is ready to take. We need more conversation. We need to bring all the various actors to the table. And luckily, the voices of our three speakers are part of this solution. They all, in their different role and in the different voices that they help amplify and bring to the online world, are part of this solution. So thank you all. That will be my answer/closing remarks. And of course, I want to thank our three speakers, Trésor, Vitika, Rima. Despite the internet connection, it's been a pleasure having that conversation with you. We could go on for hours.
Yes, thank you also, Melody, for moderating. And again, thank you for the speakers, but also thank you for the audience for participating at home, interacting with us, asking good questions. I hope this session encourages you to keep the conversation going and that you enjoyed this session. This session was organized by RNW Media for the World Press Freedom Conference 2020. If you want more information, have any questions, do visit the website of RNW Media. Thank you so much for joining in today and have a lovely day. Bye-bye.